Revenge is a powerful combination of anger, hatred, and a deep sense of justice. It's the kind of emotional drive that makes a person feel not just hurt, but completely convinced they're right to get even and settle the score. Back in medieval Europe, people didn't usually see revenge as a disgraceful mistake or a loss of self-control. In many cases, it was respected and even praised by society. Inspired by the Old Testament teaching of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, taking revenge wasn't simply accepted. It was often viewed as the proper thing to do. So today, I'm going to take you back to the Middle Ages, where we'll explore some of the most unforgettable, ruthless, and brutal acts of revenge from that era. Dandolo, the Doge. Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice, mysteriously lost his eyesight during a diplomatic mission to Constantinople in 1171. No one knows for certain what really happened. Some believed the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I ordered him to be blinded, while others thought he lost his vision after suffering a serious blow to the head in an accident. Whatever the truth may have been, Dandolo returned to Venice completely blind. According to historical accounts, he held the Byzantine Empire responsible for what happened and spent the rest of his life nursing a deep grudge, using his growing political influence to pursue a personal campaign of revenge. When Venice began preparing ships for the Fourth Crusade, Dandolo made himself impossible to ignore. He helped finance crusaders who couldn't afford the journey, backed men who probably never should have earned anyone's trust, and expected to receive a generous share of whatever riches the expedition uncovered in return. The Crusaders finally sailed from Venice in late 1202, but instead of heading directly toward their original destination, they first turned their attention to the wealthy trading city of Zara. It was an attractive target because it was rich and relatively easy to attack. After capturing and looting the city, the Crusaders stayed there through the winter before continuing their journey to Constantinople. In April 1204, they stormed and brutally sacked Constantinople as well. That wasn't part of the original mission, at least not officially. Even so, many historians have argued that the decision to divert the crusade toward the Byzantine capital was heavily influenced by Dandolo's long-standing desire to settle old scores with the empire he blamed for his blindness. The conquest brought enormous wealth, and Dandolo reportedly sent wagon-loads of treasure back to Venice from the fallen city. He never returned there himself, though. Instead, the blind Doge spent the rest of his life in Constantinople, and eventually died in the very city he had hated and resented for decades. At war with love, King Edward II of England's devotion to Piers Gaveston was impossible to hide. Everyone knew how much the king cared for him, and that close relationship infuriated the English barons. By 1312, Piers had become the Earl of Cornwall, had even served as regent while Edward traveled to marry Isabella of France, and had already been sent into exile more than once because of the growing political tension surrounding him. As the conflict with the barons escalated, Piers took refuge in Scarborough Castle. After enduring a siege, he eventually surrendered and was taken to Warwick Castle. There, Thomas of Lancaster and Guy de Beauchamp, the Earl of Warwick, condemned him to death. Later that same year, in 1312, Piers was executed by beheading. Edward was devastated by the loss. Some historians believe that much of what he did afterward was driven by a desire for revenge. One theory suggests he targeted Robert the Bruce because the Scottish king had refused to shelter Piers earlier that year, a decision that contributed to Edward's determination to launch the campaign that ended in the disastrous Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Others argue that Edward's renewed war against the English barons in 1321 was another attempt to settle old scores. He never truly forgave the men responsible for Piers's death, and years later, he was finally in a position to strike back. By that time, Edward had another powerful favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Just like Piers before him, Hugh's growing influence over the king outraged the barons. Once again, they forced the king's favorite into exile. Edward appeared to accept their demands, pardoned the rebellious nobles, and acted as though the conflict was over. In reality, he was quietly preparing for war. His chance came when Queen Isabella's royal escort was attacked at the home of the rebel ally Bartholomew Badlesmere. Edward used the incident as the justification he needed. He immediately recalled the Despensers, crushed the rebellion, and finally took revenge on the men he believed were responsible for Piers Gaveston's death. Thomas of Lancaster was captured, convicted of treason, and executed, bringing Edward's long-awaited revenge to a brutal conclusion. Timur's Trophy. In 1402, the Battle of Ankara brought two bitter rivals face to face. On one side stood Timur, also known as Tamerlane, the powerful Turco-Mongol conqueror. Opposing him was the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I, whose expansion into Anatolia had brought him into direct conflict with Timur. As Bayezid pushed farther east, he defeated several local rulers who were loyal to Timur, giving the conqueror every reason to seek revenge. When the two armies finally met, the result was a disaster for the Ottoman forces. Bayezid was defeated, captured, and taken prisoner. According to some of the more dramatic medieval chroniclers, he spent the rest of his life being transported across Anatolia inside a cage, almost like a rare animal being put on display for everyone to see. The stories claim that Timur proudly showed off his defeated rival the way someone might display a prized hunting falcon. Some accounts go even further, saying Bayezid was forced to serve as a human footstool whenever Timur climbed onto his horse. Other versions of the story describe an even deeper humiliation, claiming that Bayezid had to watch as his wives and concubines waited on Timur's guests and served them food during lavish gatherings. Whether every one of these details is historically accurate or simply the result of storytellers adding extra drama over the years is still debated. Even so, the message behind the stories has always remained the same. Timur wanted everyone to know, without any doubt, exactly who had emerged as the victor. The power of Portuguese love. The story of Pedro I of Portugal and Inês de Castro begins as a romance, but it eventually turns into one of the darkest love stories in medieval history. Before he became king in 1357, Pedro entered a political marriage with Constanza Manuel. When she arrived in Portugal in 1340, she brought her lady-in-waiting, Inês de Castro, with her. It didn't take long for Pedro to fall deeply and hopelessly in love with Inês. Their relationship was impossible to hide, and before long, everyone at court knew about it. That included Pedro's father, King Afonso IV, who strongly disapproved of the romance and saw it as a serious threat. After Constanza died in 1345, Pedro is believed to have secretly obtained permission from the church to marry Inês. To avoid provoking his father even further, they kept the marriage hidden from the public. During their years together, Inês gave birth to 4 of Pedro's children, and despite repeated pressure from his father, Pedro refused every attempt to arrange another marriage for him. Eventually, Afonso decided the relationship had gone on long enough. In 1355, he either ordered or approved the murder of Inês de Castro. She was brutally beheaded in front of her own children, bringing their love story to a horrifying end. When Pedro finally became king, he made sure the people responsible would pay. He publicly declared that Inês had been his lawful wife all along, officially recognized their children as legitimate heirs, and, according to tradition, had her body exhumed so she could be crowned queen. Dressed in magnificent royal robes, her remains were placed on the throne in a dramatic final act of defiance against his father's memory. Pedro then hunted down the 3 men he believed had taken part in Inês's murder: Alvaro Gonçalves, Diogo López Pacheco, and Pero Coelho. Pacheco was ultimately declared innocent and escaped punishment, but the other 2 were not so fortunate. Historical accounts say they endured torture with what was described as firmness truly admirable. Afterward, they were brought before a scaffold outside the royal palace, where they were executed in one of the most brutal ways imaginable. Their hearts were cut out while they were still alive, their bodies were burned, and their ashes were scattered to the wind. It was Pedro's final and terrifying act of revenge for the woman he never stopped loving. Heavy metal. As Genghis Khan carved his way across Asia and built the Mongol Empire through relentless conquest, he also worked to establish diplomatic and trade agreements with neighboring states. One of those agreements was shattered in spectacular fashion by the Khwarezmian ruler Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad II in the early 13th century. Under the treaty, Mongol merchants were supposed to travel safely through the Khwarezmian Empire, but the governor of Otrar, Inalchuk, completely ignored that promise. Believing that a Mongol trade caravan was actually a group of spies, and no doubt tempted by the wealth they carried, he ordered the execution of several hundred merchants and seized all of their goods for himself. One man managed to escape the massacre and returned to Genghis Khan with the horrifying news. Outraged by what had happened, Genghis demanded justice. Instead of making peace, the Shah chose a disastrous response. He ordered one of the Mongol envoys to be beheaded and humiliated the others before sending them back. It was the kind of diplomatic decision that could only end in disaster. Genghis Khan answered with a full-scale invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire. When the Mongol army reached Otrar, the city resisted for 5 months before finally falling. After its defenses collapsed, much of the population was either killed or forced into slavery. As for Inalchuk, the governor whose actions had started the conflict, the stories say he met a fittingly horrific end. According to traditional accounts, he was executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a punishment meant to match the scale of his betrayal. Vlad as a hatter. When people hear the name Vlad III of Wallachia, they're more likely to recognize him as Vlad the Impaler. His reputation for incredible cruelty eventually became one of the inspirations behind Bram Stoker's famous character, Count Dracula. As terrifying as the legends may sound, Vlad's reputation wasn't built on fiction alone. He ruled with an iron fist and became infamous for the horrifying punishments he inflicted on anyone he considered an enemy. His preferred method of execution was impalement, and he took the practice to an especially gruesome level. Historical accounts describe how he refined the technique so that his victims could remain alive for days, forcing them to suffer for as long as possible before finally dying. Few people experienced Vlad's wrath more than the Ottoman Turks. He hated them intensely and never passed up an opportunity to make that hatred known. One of the most infamous stories took place in 1459, when Sultan Mehmed II sent a group of emissaries to collect the tribute that Wallachia was expected to pay. Vlad welcomed the delegation politely at first. Then he asked the envoys to remove their turbans as a sign of respect. They refused, explaining that their religious beliefs required them to keep their head coverings on at all times. Vlad claimed he had a solution that would make sure their turbans never came off again. He ordered his men to nail the turbans directly to the envoys' heads. Whether remembered as history or legend, stories like this are the reason Vlad the Impaler's name has survived for centuries. They cemented his reputation as one of the most ruthless and bloodthirsty rulers the world has ever known. Second time. Around Justinian II ruled as Byzantine emperor on 2 separate occasions. His first reign lasted from 685 to 695, and after losing the throne, he managed the remarkable feat of reclaiming it in 705, ruling again until 711. People remembered him by the nickname the Slit-Nosed, a reminder of the brutal punishment he suffered after a revolt in 695. During the uprising, one of his generals, Leontios, overthrew him and had his nose cut off, a mutilation meant to make sure he could never rule again. But Justinian was not the kind of man to accept defeat. Known for his own ruthless nature, he spent years planning his return. In 705, he secretly made his way back into Constantinople, launched a successful coup, and overthrew the reigning emperor Tiberius III, reclaiming the imperial throne for himself. Once he was back in power, Justinian wasted no time settling old scores. He tracked down both Leontios and Tiberios, had them captured, chained, and dragged into the hippodrome before a crowd eager to witness their humiliation. By then, Justinian had replaced his missing nose with a solid gold prosthetic, making his appearance just as unforgettable as his reputation. In front of the cheering spectators, he placed his feet on the necks of his defeated enemies in a dramatic display of absolute victory and complete domination. The public humiliation was only the beginning. Justinian ordered both men to be beheaded, then turned his attention to their followers. Many of their supporters were executed, and according to the historical accounts, several were sewn into sacks before being thrown into the sea to die. His return to the throne wasn't simply a political comeback. It became a carefully orchestrated campaign of revenge, with Justinian determined to punish everyone who had taken part in his downfall. Those bloody Vikings historians still debate whether the infamous Viking punishment known as the Blood Eagle was ever actually carried out, or if it existed only in legend. Even so, the ritual appears in two important pieces of Old Norse literature, which has kept the story alive for centuries. According to those accounts, the punishment was unimaginably cruel. The victim was first tied face down so there was no chance of escape. A blade was then driven into the flesh at the base of the spine and slowly worked upward along the back toward the ribs. One by one, each rib was carefully cut loose from the spine with an axe, a gruesome process that demanded both patience and precision from the executioner. The most horrifying part of the story is that the victim was believed to remain alive through much of the ordeal. To make the suffering even worse, the Vikings were said to rub salt directly into the exposed wounds, intensifying the pain. As if that weren't brutal enough, the ritual supposedly ended with an even more disturbing display. Once the ribs had been pulled away and spread outward like twisted wings, the executioner drew the victim's lungs out through the opening and arranged them so they hung outside the body. According to the legend, the final result made the victim appear to have wings, transforming a human being into something resembling a grotesque, blood-soaked bird. One of the best-known stories involving the Blood Eagle comes from the Old Norse tale, the Tale of Ragnar's Sons. According to the saga, the punishment was carried out as an act of revenge against King Ella of Northumbria during the 9th century. After Ella executed the legendary Viking leader Ragnar Lothbrok by throwing him into a pit of venomous snakes, Ragnar's sons, Ivar the Boneless and his brother Ubba, avenged their father's death by condemning the king to the horrific Blood Eagle punishment. Basil, the Bulgar Slayer. The nickname says almost everything you need to know about him. Basil II, known throughout history as Basil, the Bulgar Slayer, ruled the Byzantine Empire for nearly half a century. He was a fearless soldier, a skilled horseman, and a commander who preferred standing on the battlefield with his troops rather than spending his days safely inside the palace. Throughout his long reign, Basil fought against rebellions within his empire and constantly battled his Muslim neighbors. But no enemy angered him quite as much as the Bulgarians. After suffering a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Trajan's Gate in 986, Basil became determined to make Bulgaria pay. From that moment on, he would not stop until he had completely crushed the power of his enemies. The Bulgarian ruler, Tsar Samuel, attempted to halt the Byzantine advance by fortifying the strategically important Kladion Pass. At first, his plan worked perfectly. The Byzantine army repeatedly failed to break through the defenses, and the Bulgarians appeared to have the advantage. But Basil eventually found another way. His general, Nikephoros Xiphias, led a force through a difficult mountain route, circling around the Bulgarian position and appearing behind their army. With Basil attacking from the front and Nikephoros striking from the rear, the Bulgarians were trapped and defeated at the Battle of Kladion on July 29, 1014. Basil captured around 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers after the battle. According to Byzantine chroniclers, his revenge was as brutal as his reputation suggested. He supposedly ordered that 99 out of every 100 prisoners be blinded, while the remaining one man in each group was left with a single eye so he could guide the others back home. The story of this punishment became one of the most infamous examples of medieval vengeance and earned Basil II the terrifying title that followed him through history, the Bulgar Slayer. Blessed Princess Saint Olga. The Drevlians were unfortunate neighbors of the Kievan Rus. They were unfortunate because in 945 they made one of the worst decisions imaginable. They murdered King Igor I of Kiev. After his death, Igor's wife, Olga of Kiev, took control as regent for their young son. But she wasn't simply going to wait quietly for justice. Instead, she began planning a revenge campaign so elaborate and ruthless that it sounds almost like something created for a medieval drama. The Drevlians soon sent a group of envoys to Olga, hoping to convince her to marry their prince. It was an incredibly bold request, especially considering the small detail that they were the ones who had killed her husband. Olga welcomed the messengers and calmly told them to rest and return the following morning. When they came back, she had them thrown into a pit and burned alive. But Olga wasn't finished. She then sent word to the Drevlians asking them to send their most respected nobles to negotiate with her. Believing they had a chance to make peace, the Drevlians agreed and sent their leading men. Olga invited them into a bathhouse, but once they were inside, she locked the doors and burned them alive. Still seeking revenge, Olga sent another message to the Drevlians. She told them she was coming to their city and asked them to prepare a great feast with plenty of mead so she could mourn at the place where her husband had been killed. The Drevlians prepared an enormous amount of alcohol, believing the conflict was finally coming to an end. But after the feast began and everyone had become heavily intoxicated, Olga's soldiers attacked. According to the chronicles, around 5,000 Drevlians were killed that night. Olga returned to Kiev, gathered an army, and marched back to finish what she had started. The siege lasted for an entire year, and eventually, the starving Drevlians surrendered and begged for peace. Olga then demanded what seemed like a strangely small tribute: 3 sparrows and 3 pigeons from every household. Relieved that the nightmare was finally over, the Drevlians agreed and delivered the birds. But Olga had one final trick. She ordered her people to attach small bags of burning sulfur to the birds before setting them free. The birds flew back to their homes throughout the city, carrying their dangerous cargo with them. Soon, fires spread everywhere, and the entire settlement was consumed by flames. As the Drevlians tried to escape the destruction, Olga's forces attacked and killed those who remained. After avenging her husband and destroying an entire people, Olga's story took an unexpected turn. She later converted to Christianity and was eventually canonized as a saint, receiving the title of Saint Olga, equal to the apostles. Now, I believe everyone deserves the chance to change and find redemption, but Olga's path from ruthless avenger to revered saint is certainly one of the most unusual transformations in history. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Medieval Madness. If you enjoyed the story, consider subscribing because it truly helps the channel, and I release new videos exploring the strange and fascinating world of the Middle Ages every Friday. For those who want to support the channel even more, there are Patreon and YouTube membership options available, where I share extra content and bonus videos. There's also a special membership tier that allows supporters to have their names featured at the end of each episode, alongside the amazing people who help make this work possible. I genuinely appreciate all the support you give. It means a great deal and directly helps me continue creating these videos and sharing more stories from the past. Until next time, I'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.